Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. Second Chances Under Montana Skies by Emma Ashwood. Chapter 1. 14th of March, 1893, Jersey City. Scarlet Edge woke up in the middle of the night. She glanced around her room, waiting for her eyes to adjust to the dark while she tried to figure out what had woken her. Although she had been married to Ned Edge for the last 4 years, Scarlet had her own quarters. She didn't mind the privacy that came with having her own bedroom. In fact, she cherished it. Her marriage to Ned had never been one of love, and when he did visit her quarters, she executed her wifely obligations out of duty, not of love. She could hear the voices in the drawing room below and realized that was what had woken her. Scarlet stood up and pulled on a red lace nightgown, one that she abhorred and only wore because Ned insisted upon it. With slippered feet, she quietly padded downstairs for a glass of water, knowing that she wouldn't be welcome in the conversation in the drawing room. Ned's business practices didn't abide by office hours, or reasonable hours for that matter. Just as his business was more often conducted in the dark rather than in the daylight hours. A shiver traveled down her spine as she wondered what her dearest husband was up to tonight. She overheard Ned's voice as she walked into the kitchen and realized that he was recruiting. "You're new in town, and being new in town is dangerous. My people can provide you with protection, money, and purpose. No more scraping by or digging through the trash for a single meal. You're a skilled pickpocket, and we can harness that skill so that you are able to make a living from it. So what do you say? Are you in?" Ned asked in a cheerful voice. A shiver traveled down Scarlet's spine as she quickly headed back upstairs. She had heard those words too often over the last 4 years, and not once had she heard anyone decline Ned's offer. If only those poor immigrants knew what they were submitting themselves to when they agreed to work with Ned. Her husband, a known criminal in Jersey City, not only had the power to drive the fear of God into his enemies, but he could weaponize an army with the number of guns he moved and sold. Then there were the watered-down barrels of whiskey and bourbon that he sold to merchants out west, and of course, his share in 2 establishments of disrepute. Ned Edge might be many things, but stupid wasn't one of them. He knew exactly where to find his victims, how to lure them in, and how to keep them on a leash for the rest of their lives. Just like the men that worked for him were poor, impoverished immigrants, struggling to find work, the women that worked in his establishments were desperate and in need of protection. Ned had a way of charming them into believing that he was doing them a favor. A tear slipped over Scarlet's cheek as she closed her bedroom door behind her. For 4 years, she had been witness to her husband's crimes, his evil ways, and his heartless treatment of people. Everything Ned stood for went against her Christian beliefs. She blamed her father every single day for forcing her into an arranged marriage with Ned, and although she blamed her father, she missed him dearly. Her father had been a kind and caring man. He had been hard-working and had worked shifts on the docks his entire life. But somehow he happened upon one of Ned's gambling houses. The bug bit, and her father had been hooked. Before long, he had borrowed more than he could ever repay. Scarlet, only 18 at the time, had been blissfully unaware of her father's gambling problems until he arrived home one evening in the company of Ned and his 2 thugs. The decision had been put to Scarlet, and she had made her choice: marry Ned Edge or witness her father's unlawful execution. Scarlet had chosen her father's life and had given up her own future in return. Little did she know that he would die of a heart attack only a month after her wedding. Without her father, Scarlet was alone in a world of crime and sin. After her father's death, Scarlet tried to run away on more than once occasion. But Ned knew too many people and had too many people working for him. She was always found before she even reached the ferry to New York. The last time, Ned had promised to put her out of her misery if she tried again. Scarlet hadn't tried escaping the misery that was her life again. Instead, she tried to be grateful for having shelter and food, because love or affection didn't exist in Ned's world. 18 years her senior, Ned was all Scarlet had never wanted in a husband, and yet she had vowed to obey and respect him for the rest of her life. She reached for the small pile of letters hidden behind her bed and let out a sigh of relief that her secret was still safe. Although she was married, Scarlet had been struggling with loneliness for a very long time. Last year, she had happened across the matrimonial times by chance. In a moment of weakness, she had reached out to a rancher, seeking friendship. They had been corresponding ever since. In her heart, Scarlet knew it was wrong to correspond with another man as a married woman, but there could be no harm in having a friend on the other side of the country. Could there? Todd Bickers not only offered her a glimmer of hope in a dark world, but he also offered her an escape from the crime-infested city in which she lived. Although Scarlet had never revealed her hopes and dreams to Todd, she couldn't help but hope that someday in the future she would have the courage to divorce Ned and travel west to meet him. She wasn't counting on romance as much as she was hoping for a fresh start far away from Jersey City and the Dead Rabbits gang. Chapter 2. 22nd of March, 1893, Jersey City. Scarlet had been married to a mobster long enough to recognize the sound of a gunshot in the early morning hours. Startled, she sat up in bed as fear pulsed through her veins with pure adrenaline. She heard men's voices coming from downstairs and wondered who had been on the receiving end of that bullet. Although Ned moved guns and owned them, he never wore one on his person. He had 2 thugs follow him everywhere for protection if he needed it. Scarlet carefully climbed out of bed and moved to the window to see if anything on the street might inform her of what was happening downstairs. She saw a carriage and watched 2 men come out of her house and climb in. They wore hats and dark coats, making them impossible to recognize in the dark. She waited by the window for a while, listening for voices or any movement downstairs. After about 10 minutes, when she was certain the coast was clear, Scarlet started towards the stairs. With every stair she took, she held her breath, fearing that she might be the next to be shot. Or worse, that Ned would think she was spying on him and punish her with a kiss from his fist. By the time she reached the landing, it was still quiet. She cautiously moved towards the drawing room and peered around the doorway. A shriek escaped her as she took 3 steps back and bumped into a table in the hallway. Backing up gave her a clearer view of the living room and the sight that made her shriek in the first place. Ned lay in a pool of his own blood, face down on the floor. Whoever had just left her home in a carriage had murdered her husband. It wasn't grief that washed over Scarlet, but rather shock. She had never felt any affection or love for Ned. But the sight of a dead man made her quiver. Scarlet wasn't sure how long she stood against the table, quivering as adrenaline coursed through her veins with shock. But there she stood until the police arrived and an officer escorted her to the kitchen. The neighbors had sent for the police when they heard the gunshot, and knowing it was the home of mob boss Ned Edge, they had come around, hoping to find Ned in the act of cleaning up his mess. Instead, they found Ned executed in his own living room. "Ma'am, I know this must be terribly shocking for you, but I need to know what you saw," the police officer prompted. Scarlet shook her head. "Nothing. I didn't see anything. I woke up with the gunshot and came downstairs after." "So you didn't hear anything? An argument?" the man probed further. Scarlet frowned and shook her head. "No. Wait, I did see from upstairs 2 men climbing into a carriage. They wore hats, so I couldn't recognize them." "So you witnessed 2 men leaving the scene?" he asked for confirmation. Scarlet nodded. "Yes, I waited upstairs for a long time before I came down. Then, I saw Ned." The officer nodded sympathetically. "I'm sure it must have been a shock. I'm sorry to ask this, but ma'am, were you aware of your husband's business dealings?" Scarlet met the officer's questioning look, wondering how she should answer. If she told the officer the truth, she might be arrested, but if she lied, she was protecting a criminal. She drew in a sharp breath before she spoke. "I'm aware that he was party to criminal activity, although not the particulars. I was always ordered to leave the room when he had associates over. I never met anyone or knew about the dealings taking place. So he kept you away from that part of his life? The officer asked for clarification. Scarlet nodded. I wish I never had to be part of his life at all. You were married, were you not? The officer asked, confused. Scarlet let out a wry snicker. Prolly, I was given a choice 4 years ago to marry Ned or he would kill my father for his gambling debts. The officer's eyes widened with horror. Would you like me to send for your father? Scarlet shook her head as she held his gaze. He passed a month after the wedding, consumption. The officer let out a gasp. I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am. Me, too, Scarlet admitted. What happens now? The officer shrugged. Given your husband's associates, I'm not sure we'll ever find his murderer. I don't expect you will. Scarlet nodded in agreement. The men her husband worked with, especially his enemies, didn't leave a trail. They worked, and fast and effectively outran the law every single time. Do you have somewhere you can stay tonight until we get this mess cleaned up for you? The officer asked kindly. Scarlet shook her head. I have no one. I'll deal with the mess in the morning. Would you excuse me, officer? I'd like to retire to my room. Of course. I'll stop by tomorrow to help you make arrangements for the funeral, the officer offered. I'll manage, Scarlet informed him. Good night, officer. Scarlet walked out of the kitchen and stopped at the door of the drawing room. She glanced at Ned's lifeless body one last time before she headed upstairs. The moment she stepped through her bedroom door, Scarlet felt a glimmer of hope spark in her soul. She had been praying for a way to be free from Ned for so many years, but she hadn't actually believed it would ever happen. She was sorry that her opportunity for a fresh start came with Ned having died, but at least she could finally put this part of her life behind her and look to the future. Chapter 3. 25th of March, 1893, Jersey City. Scarlet felt like an outsider at her own husband's funeral. She stood alone beside his grave with no one by her side, while groups of people were gathered all around. A few men, looking businesslike in suits, stood to one side having a serious conversation, glancing at her every now and then. Across from her stood a group of women, almost 20 if Scarlet had to guess, all weeping over Ned's death. Something Scarlet hadn't done. She didn't have to ask who they were. Judging by their makeup and exposing clothing, Scarlet knew they worked in Ned's establishments. Then there was the group of younger men standing to one side, speaking in hushed voices as they glanced at the men in suits with malice in their eyes. Scarlet didn't know much about the criminal underworld of Jersey City, but she knew enough to know that the groups gathered at her husband's funeral weren't there to pay their respects. They were there to see who was going to take Ned's place. A shiver of fear ran down her spine, wondering if the next man in charge of the dead rabbits could be even more heartless than Ned. If her marriage to Ned had taught her one thing, it was that there was no length they wouldn't go to protect themselves or seek vengeance. Whoever the man was that had taken Ned's life wouldn't be judged by a court of law, but he would be punished by a group of his peers. That much Scarlet knew. The glimmer of hope that had sparked inside her on the night of Ned's death had been doused with ice water the following morning, when Scarlet had learned through Ned's lawyer that the house she called home would be foreclosed on by the bank. All Scarlet had to show for 4 years of her life, with a criminal mastermind in the slums of Jersey, were a few pieces of furniture and not even a dime to her name. She had nowhere to live, and she needed to vacate the house within 2 weeks. She had no friends, no money, and no future. For the first time, she could understand why the women in Ned's establishments accepted his offer. They had to be desperate and out of options. But Scarlet wasn't that desperate just yet. She still had hope in Todd. It had been almost a month since she had last heard from him, but today Scarlet planned on writing to him. It was time to be honest about her past and her marriage to Ned. If Todd still wanted to correspond with her after he learned about her past, then perhaps Scarlet might allow herself to dream of a future again. She was the first to leave Ned's grave, sensing that arguments were about to ensue between the different parties of men. Scarlet wanted no part in that world anymore. If Ned's death had given her one thing, it was an escape from the criminal underworld she had been forced to be married into. It was a balmy afternoon, and Scarlet could sense that spring was in the air. As she walked home, not even the promise of flowers in window boxes that would appear in the next few weeks could make her feel more hopeful about what her future would hold. Tomorrow, she would need to start looking for a boarding house, one that only offered room and board to respectable people. It would cost a pretty penny, but hopefully if she sold all the furniture she had inherited from Ned, she would be able to afford it. Next, she would need to find gainful employment. Scarlet had never worked and wasn't even sure where to begin. She was good at keeping house, but unless she managed to find work as a housekeeper in one of the brownstones of New York, she couldn't earn a living by cleaning. She arrived at the home in which Ned had been murdered by late afternoon. As was her habit, she checked the mailbox before approaching the front door. Prosody. Ever since she had received her first letter from Todd, Scarlet checked the mailbox every day without fail, sometimes twice a day, fearing that Ned would come across Todd's letters. She hadn't expected a letter from Ned, but as she opened the mailbox, she recognized his handwriting instantly. Her heart skipped a beat as she retrieved the letter and rushed into the house. She hadn't spent any time in the drawing room since she had cleaned up Ned's blood. Instead, her time was spent between the kitchen and her bedroom. A letter from Todd called for a cup of tea, she decided as she headed into the kitchen. While the water heated on the wood stove, Scarlet began to read Todd's latest letter. Dear Scarlet, I am sorry for my delay in replying to your last letter. We had a freak blizzard at the beginning of March that not only wreaked havoc on the fences, but resulted in a chaotic 2 weeks of repairs in its wake. Over the last month, I've had ample time to think about our correspondence. It has been almost a year since you responded to my advertisement, offering me your friendship. Over the last year, your letters have become the high point of my week. We have shared so much of ourselves, our pasts, and our dreams for the future that I must admit I am no longer willing to accept your offer of friendship. Scarlet's heart skipped a beat as a frown creased her brow. When my sister Jane encouraged me to place an advertisement, I made her aware of the fact that I do not believe love can be found between the lines of letters written by a complete stranger. But I've come to realize that I was wrong. Without seeing your face or hearing your voice, I have developed affectionate feelings for you. I have come to dream of my future, and every dream includes you. I know that we have never spoken of our feelings or the possibility of romance, but it is time for me to admit that I have fallen in love with you. If you do not feel the same, I am afraid this will be the last letter I write to you. But if you do feel the same, Scarlet, and I hope you do, I want to ask you to join me in Montana. I want you to travel west by train and to become my wife. I truly believe that the connection we share is strong enough to last a lifetime. I trust that our friendship will be the foundation of a lasting love, one that will sustain us while raising children and cattle and building a life on my ranch. I have enclosed in this letter enough funds to pay for your journey west and for incidentals. I have also enclosed details for you to send a telegram to inform me of your decision. Unfortunately, my patience will not endure waiting on a letter for your reply. I sincerely hope you accept my offer and that I will meet you soon. Affectionate regards, Todd Bickers. Scarlet's eyes widened with surprise, even as her heart swelled with joy and hope. Of all the things she had imagined the day of Ned's funeral would bring, a proposal hadn't even been on her mind. Suddenly, the last 4 years faded away to be replaced instead with excitement over what the future might hold. She had hoped to write to Todd and tell him about her life with Ned, but did all that really matter now? Ned was in her past, and so was her marriage to him. Surely it didn't make sense to delay her journey west, just to tell Todd about the gruesome murder that had made her a widow. Instead, Scarlet reached for her own stationery and began to make a list of everything she could sell and what she would take with her to Montana. Chapter 4. 27th of March, 1893, The Long Journey West. Scarlet had never been on a train. She had seen them coming into Jersey City and had watched from a distance as stylish women boarded the train, wearing extravagant hats and accompanied by expensive luggage. She had imagined where they were traveling to and what they would experience on the journey, but she had never imagined boarding the train herself. Scarlet was neither stylish nor wearing an extravagant hat as she boarded the train early on the morning of the 27th of March. Regardless of her anxiety about the journey, she was relieved to rest her feet after the chaos of the day before. Between selling all her furniture, purchasing a few new dresses for the journey and her new life in the West, and packing everything she planned on keeping, Scarlet's feet were aching by the time she lay down on a mattress in the corner of her empty room the night before. The house had been completely cleared of anything of value, and what was left, the bank could take with the house as part of the foreclosure. A telegram had been sent to Montana to inform Todd of her decision and her arrival date in 14 days. The train was abuzz with people, all eager to start their journey to the West. Scarlet recognized a few foreign languages as she made her way through the numerous rows of seats before finally finding her seat by the window. She hadn't had enough money to pay for a cot, so for the next 2 weeks, the seat would not only be her bed, but also her chair during the day. Scarlet stowed her carpet bag beneath her seat and hoped that her 2 steam trunks would make it to the baggage car in the care of the porter as everyone began to settle around her. They had a long journey ahead of them, and Scarlet was excited to finally meet Todd in person, but also for the journey and all she would see. She had heard of mountains, plains, and aboriginals, of highwaymen, mines, and forests, and had never witnessed any one of those herself. As the train pulled out of the station, Scarlet drew in a deep breath and knew she was finally leaving her life and her past behind in Jersey City. She was finally able to get that fresh start and was engaged to a man who seemed to be generous, hardworking, honest, and kind. Everything that Ned hadn't been. Of course, there was a chance that Todd had lied about himself in his letters, but Scarlet doubted that one could keep up a lie for such a long period of time. Through his letters, she had not only come to know Todd, but also his sister, Jane, who lived with him. She had learned about their expansive ranch and his cattle operation, as well as Jane's vegetable garden and love for sewing. Scarlet had learned about their small town, through which gossip traveled faster than the horses, and even about their church, where the Word of God was celebrated every Sunday. Scarlet was under no impression that life on a ranch in the frontier would be easy. She understood from Todd's letters that life could be brutal and hard, and that the work on a ranch was never done. Luckily, she had never been afraid to work, and she was a quick learner. Her eyes began to grow heavy as the train flew by the buildings and slums of New Jersey. Scarlet didn't even fight the fatigue. It had been an exhausting 2 weeks, and she planned to rest during the journey as much as she could, not only to cleanse herself of the past, but to heal her soul and her mind before she finally met Todd. She fell asleep with her head resting against the window and a smile on her face. Chapter 5. 3rd of April, 1893, halfway to Montana. "Excuse me, I'm so sorry to bother you." Scarlet looked up and saw a woman leaning into her row. The passengers that had sat beside Scarlet had disembarked from the train the day before, giving Scarlet a little more space to stretch out during the night. After having been on the train for 7 nights, she was looking very much forward to her arrival in Montana in a week. She was only halfway through her journey, but already Scarlet was exhausted due to the cramped situation and continuous throng of people in her space. "Yes?" Scarlet replied with a questioning look. She recognized the woman who sat a few rows behind her with her 4 daughters. "My daughter is on the rag, you see, and I made the mistake of packing all the menstrual rags in our suitcases," the woman admitted with a horrified look. "I have a spare dress for her to change into, but I have no means of washing the one she's wearing now." Scarlet could only imagine the girl's humiliation for being on the rag whilst on a train journey with numerous men. "Of course. I think I have a few in my carpet bag." Scarlet reached beneath her seat and pulled out her carpet bag. She set it on the open seat and began to scour through the contents. She pushed the clean set of undergarments aside, pulled out the bag of rations, and continued to search. Finally, in the bottom of her carpet bag, she found the woman's necessities which she had packed for the journey. Here, she can have these. Oh, that is very kind of you. Perhaps keep one for yourself. The woman handed a rag back to Scarlet. Scarlet nodded. Thank you. Can I pay you for them? I have money, the woman offered, although Scarlet could tell she didn't have much in the way of funds. Scarlet shook her head fervently. No, please. It's a gift. No payment needed. Thank you very much. You're very kind. God bless you. With that, the woman disappeared towards her own row before having a hushed conversation with a girl that Scarlet guessed to be about 17 years old. She turned back in her seat and began to repack her carpet bag before helping herself to some jerky. As she chewed, she realized that she could not remember when she had her last monthlies. For the life of her, she couldn't seem to remember the date. She thought back to the last month, the month before that, and finally, all the way back to January. Scarlet's heart stopped as she remembered washing her rags in January. She could still remember the day clearly because it had been snowing outside. Usually, Scarlet would hang her rags out to dry in the sun, but in January, she had hung them over a chair beside the wood stove, the only fitting place for them to dry. The memory was still fresh in her mind because Ned had come home unexpectedly, and Scarlet had stuffed the rags into her apron to save her any humiliation. What about February? She tried to think back to February. March? During the weeks leading up to Ned's death, Scarlet realized that she had missed being on the rag. Fear gripped her belly, twisting and turning it until Scarlet felt almost nauseous with anxiety. She couldn't be pregnant, could she? She would have known if she was pregnant. Women spoke about their bodies changing during pregnancy all the time, about how they had known even before they missed a period. If Scarlet was pregnant, she would have known, she assured herself. But the more she thought about it, the more worried she became. What if she wasn't as aware of her body as to sense that there was a life growing inside of her? Or perhaps she had been so distracted by Ned's death that she had missed her cycle. Maybe she just didn't remember having her cycle. The more she tried to convince herself that she wasn't pregnant, the more a little voice in the back of her mind assured her that she was. Missing your menstrual cycle for 1 month due to emotional upset might be possible, but 3 months? Cold sweat beaded on Scarlet's forehead as her hand instinctively rested on her belly. Fear washed over her like a sandstorm, threatening to suffocate everything in its path. She was on her way to become Mrs. Todd Bickers. She couldn't expect Todd to marry her if she was with child, especially not with Ned Edge's child. Not knowing what else to do, Scarlet bowed her head in prayer. She began to pray in silence. Dear Lord, please help me. I'm not sure if I am with child, but if I am, Lord, please protect this baby. I know a train journey isn't pleasant for a grown person, but I can't imagine if it's safe during pregnancy. Please don't let the baby be harmed by my travels. But God, I have to be honest and admit that I hope I am wrong. I cannot be with child. Not Ned's child, God. I have just put Ned and my life with him in the past to start a new life in Montana. I cannot wish away a baby, just like I cannot change the past. God, whatever the circumstances, I beg of you to protect me, bless me, and guide me. Amen. Scarlet brushed away a tear, realizing that for a moment she had blamed an innocent unborn child for Ned's sins. If she was with child, this child would not bear his father's sins. It would be hers, and hers alone. She vowed that to herself as the sun set over the mountains in the distance. Now she only had to keep her vow and find out if she was indeed pregnant. Chapter 6. 10th April 1893, Great Falls, Montana. Excitement and relief bubbled over Scarlet as the station in Great Falls came into view. From what Scarlet had learned from other passengers, Great Falls hadn't been a town until the train station had been built there. The thoroughfare led past the station with numerous buildings on either side. A small town had come to life around the station, offering everything from barber services, general mercantile stores, feed stores, and even a dress shop. The train came to a stop, the whistle announcing its arrival. Outside the window, Scarlet could see family and friends eagerly awaiting the arrival of their loved ones on the platform. Scarlet searched the crowd, wondering which one of the men might be Todd. It was only now that she was here that she realized it would have helped to know what he looked like. Numerous passengers disembarked in Great Falls. Most would take their journey from here by wagon train. Luckily, Todd's ranch was only a 2-hour wagon ride from the station. After spending the last 2 weeks in the confines of the train, Scarlet looked forward to the fresh air, although she was certain the wagon journey might be slightly bumpy at the best of times. The conductor tipped his hat to Scarlet as she climbed down from the train. She couldn't help but be surprised by the efficiency of the train company when she saw that her 2 steam trunks had already been unloaded and were waiting for her on the platform. Not knowing where to find Todd, or even how to recognize him, Scarlet stood with her steam trunks, hoping he would find her instead. She didn't wait long before a handsome man dressed in work clothes and wearing a sweat-stained hat approached her. Regardless of the dust on his coat, he was the most attractive man that Scarlet had ever laid eyes on. Her tummy twinged with nerves as he smiled at her when he stopped. "Scarlet?" Scarlet's mouth curved into a hopeful smile. "Todd? It's a pleasure to finally meet you," Todd said with relief as he removed his hat and dragged a hand through his dusty blonde hair. His blue eyes sparkled with kindness and nerves. Scarlet nodded. "You too. Come along, I'm sure you must be exhausted after the train journey." Todd lifted one steam trunk onto his shoulder and took the other by the handle, carrying them as if they weighed nothing at all as he led her towards a wagon. "Jane refused to wait at home. She insisted on meeting you on your arrival," Todd informed her as they reached the wagon. Scarlet couldn't help but feel slightly judged when a beautiful girl, more or less her age, climbed down from the wagon with a narrowed look. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Edge. I'm Jane Bickers." Jane held out her hand and Scarlet accepted it with a smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, too, Miss Bickers. Please, do call me Scarlet. And please, let go of the formalities and call my sister Jane," Todd said as he loaded the steam trunks onto the wagon. "See, Jane, she isn't an old witch, doesn't have 12 children or a husband in tow," Todd teased his sister. Scarlet felt guilt wash over her for not having told Todd the truth sooner. She might not have 12 children or a husband in tow, but she did suspect she was pregnant, and she was a widow. She summoned a smile, knowing now wasn't the right time to tell Todd about her past. "I just wanted to make sure," Jane said with an easy smile before she turned to Scarlet. "Men can be terrible judges of character. I was just a little protective of my brother." Scarlet nodded. "I can completely understand." Prosody radiates. "On the journey here, I was terrified that your brother might be an old bald man with a penchant for drinking who was simply looking for a slave to clean his house." Jane's laughter was easy as she playfully punched her brother's arm. "He's not bald yet, and don't worry, he only drinks on occasion, and if he drinks, he only enjoys 1 glass." "Come on, you can chatter on the way back to the ranch," Todd said as he helped his sister back into the wagon. When he held out his hand to Scarlet, their eyes met for a moment, and just as Scarlet had hoped, the connection was there. The same connection she had felt with him in the letters, she felt now in his gaze. They shared a smile before Scarlet took her seat. As they drove through the thoroughfare, Jane enlightened Scarlet about the different stores and which were better to avoid. She pointed out the chapel and the dress shop, and even the school that had been built the year before. The town was simply charming, in Scarlet's opinion. When they left the town behind, Scarlet felt free in a way she had never felt before. There were no dark and gloomy buildings, no scent of manure in the air, and no sewage in the stream that trickled in the distance. This was untouched country, and it was more beautiful than Scarlet could have ever imagined. "It's different from Jersey City?" Jane asked with curiosity. Scarlet couldn't help but laugh. "Different? It's a different world altogether. It's simply beautiful." "I agree. I can't imagine living anywhere else," Todd added before he turned to Scarlet. "I hope you agree that we take some time to get to know each other before we are married. With Jane as an escort, I assure you that your reputation won't be harmed by living with us unmarried. Scarlet couldn't help but appreciate his kindness and forethought for her reputation. That's a very good idea, thank you. I agree, it will be nice to get to know each other better first. She turned her gaze back towards the beautiful landscape and feared that her reputation might be tarnished long before a wedding could take place. If she was indeed pregnant with Ned's child, not only would Todd not take her as his bride, but she would be lost and homeless and without a penny to her name. Chapter 7. 4th of May, 1893, Bicker Ranch, Montana. On a ranch, branding and neutering the new calves were among the most exciting and exhausting tasks of the year. But for Todd, it was also a time of celebration. Not only didn't bringing the new calves in remind him of what he was building, it was also a time for the community to come together. Yesterday, his ranch had been flooded with ranchers, friends, and curious townspeople for the branding of Bicker's calves. He had the opportunity to introduce Scarlet to his friends, and couldn't be happier with their reception of her and the way she just managed to fit in. But after all that excitement, today had been another regular day on the ranch. He had spent the morning driving the cattle back out to the fields, while the women tended to the house. As he rode back towards the cabin, he couldn't help but find himself smiling at the thought of Scarlet. She had truly amazed him by the way she had adapted to life on a ranch. She hadn't been lying when she said she was a hard worker, proving so time and time again. There simply was no chore too big and no task too strenuous, and nothing seemed to upset her, not even finding a snake in her room. Instead, she had been calm itself when she had walked into the kitchen one morning and announced that there was an unwanted visitor in her room. Jane had been so suspicious of Scarlet when Todd had told her of the engagement, but even his sister's doubts had ceased over the last few weeks. It seemed to him as if Scarlet and his sister had become fast friends. If he was honest, he had some doubts during the 2 weeks he had waited for Scarlet to arrive as well. Doubts about who she was, what her personality would be like, and if she truly was the person he had imagined her to be. But now, Todd couldn't be more sure that she was the woman with whom he wanted to spend his life. She hadn't only exceeded all his expectations, but she had already won a place for herself in his heart. If it were up to Todd, he wouldn't mind saying vows to her tomorrow. But he would keep his word and give them more time to grow closer to each other before the wedding. More time for her to adjust to life on the ranch, and more time for her to fall in love with him like he had fallen in love with her. After stabling his horse, Todd headed towards the cabin where the rich aroma of beef stew met him at the door. His mouth watered as he walked into the house, which felt welcoming with wildflowers on every surface. A smile curved his mouth as he turned to Jane. "Flowers, you've never done that before?" Jane shook her head. "It wasn't me." She turned to Scarlet, who was stirring the stew on the stove. "Scarlet thought it might give the house a nice atmosphere. I thought it would be a waste of time. But I like it. If you walk into your bedroom, it carries the scent of lilacs." Todd moved towards the kitchen. "Did you make supper as well?" he asked, surprised. Until now, she had simply assisted Jane in the kitchen. Scarlet turned to him with a smile that made his heart skip a beat. "I did. I hope you like it. It's a recipe my mother used to make." "Careful, you're becoming the perfect prairie wife," Todd teased. Scarlet smiled at him and their eyes met. For a brief moment, Todd wished his sister wasn't there. He and Scarlet had barely had any time alone since her arrival. Of course, it was for propriety, but Todd wanted to spend a little more time with Scarlet, away from his sister's prying eyes. "I must admit to enjoying life on a ranch. I wasn't sure I would," Scarlet admitted thoughtfully. "Although there is a lot of work, the views and the freedom are worth it." Todd smiled approvingly. "That's always been the way I see it." Prosody, rate percent. "Then why don't the two of you just get married and get it over with?" Jane teased. Todd ignored his sister as he reached for Scarlet's hand. "Perhaps you and I can enjoy our coffee on the porch this evening, without Jane." Jane groaned and rolled her eyes. "If you need some privacy, you can just ask." Scarlet laughed. "I'd enjoy that very much, Todd." Todd turned to his sister with a teasing look. We'd like some privacy after dinner. The stew had been more delicious than Todd had expected. The flavors were rich and perfectly complemented the beef. While his sister and Scarlet cleared up the kitchen, Todd brewed a fresh pot of coffee. A short while later, he and Scarlet were sitting on the porch under the breathtaking view of a sky filled with stars. Any regrets about coming west? Todd asked, reaching for her hand. It was the first show of affection on his part, and holding her hand felt right. Scarlet turned to him with a smile. None. I must admit, I was afraid that once we met, we wouldn't get along as I had hoped. But you've exceeded all my expectations, Todd said warmly, with a loving smile. Did you have the same fears? Scarlet hesitated for a moment before she answered. I had some fears, but they're all gone now. Scarlet looked towards the stars, and Todd couldn't help but wonder if she was lying because he felt her hands stiffen in his. We should do this more often, Todd said to assure her that she was safe with him and that he cared about her thoughts and opinions. Perhaps you'd like to learn more about the ranch? I haven't wanted to bore you with the business just yet. Scarlet turned to him with a smile. Bore me? I find it fascinating. I'd love to know more. I thought you didn't want to talk about it with me. Todd turned to her and held her gaze. Everything as far as the eye can see will be yours one day, too. Of course, I want to talk about it with you. It's our future. Their gazes held and Todd squeezed her hand. He could almost see his future unfold in her eyes. His heart swelled with hope, knowing that nothing and no one could stop him from reaching what was right in front of him, when the time was right. Chapter 8, 12th of May, 1893, Bicker Ranch, Montana. Scarlet couldn't try and fool herself for a moment longer. She thought as she hung over her chamber pot for the 4th time that morning. If she had suspected she was with child during her journey west, there was now not a single doubt in her mind. Over the last week, the symptoms she had tried to ignore had become worse. She found herself exhausted during the middle of the day, nauseous at all times of the day, and as for her body, she could feel it changing with every day that passed. Scarlet tried her best to hide her condition by only retching in her bedroom, wearing loose dresses, and trying to find excuses for her fatigue, but she knew she couldn't hide it forever. Sooner, rather than later, her belly would swell and her clothes wouldn't be able to hide the bump. If that happened before she had a moment to talk to Todd and reveal the truth about her past, their marriage would be over before they even had a wedding. Cold sweat beaded her forehead as her stomach contracted in another aim to empty itself of its contents. She lifted the chamber pot for the 4th time that morning. She wiped her face with a wet cloth, trying to figure out how she was going to sneak out of the house again to clean the chamber pot when there was a knock at the bedroom door. Scarlet? Jane's soft voice asked on the other side of the door. Are you all right? Scarlet summoned a smile, worried that her fear of being found out would be heard in her voice. I'm fine. Jane turned the knob and slowly opened the door. She met Scarlet's gaze and closed the door behind her. You're pale. You're not fine. Scarlet shook her head and summoned an assuring smile. I'm really fine. Jane sat down on the bed beside Scarlet and met her gaze. I might be a few years younger than you, but I know the signs. You're wearing your dresses looser than usual. You're tired most of the time and you spend most of your mornings over your chamber pot. Scarlet, are you with child? Scarlet's eyes widened with horror. Please, Jane, don't tell Todd just yet. I can explain. It's not what you think. Jane frowned. How can it not be? You're an unmarried woman, Scarlet. I won't let you destroy my brother's reputation. Scarlet felt fear course through her veins as she held Jane's gaze. I was married when I became pregnant. My husband passed. Does Todd know that you're a widow? Jane asked with a frown. Scarlet shook her head. No, I wanted to tell him, but then he asked me to come west, and I thought it would be better to do it in person. I haven't had the courage, and now I'm falling for him, and if I tell him, he will send me away. Scarlet couldn't stop the tears that began to stream down her face. She wept, knowing that now that her secret was out, Todd would no doubt send her back to Jersey on the first train going east. She felt Jane's hand rest on her shoulder and looked up to meet her gaze. Hush, your secret is safe with me, Jane said in a kind voice. I don't know what your circumstances were or why you chose to keep this a secret, but I do know that my brother cares for you. I'll keep your secret as long as you vow to tell him the truth before the wedding. Jane glanced at Scarlet's belly and raised a brow. How far along are you? I think about 4 months, Scarlet admitted. Then you won't have too long before Todd will learn the truth, Jane said with a firm look. Scarlet nodded. I know I need to tell him. I'm just afraid. I don't want to go back to Jersey City, my life there. I can't go back. Do you want to marry my brother to have a father for your child, or because you have feelings for him? Jane asked in a no-nonsense tone of voice. Scarlet sighed and held Jane's gaze. I only realized that I might be with child halfway through my journey here. I thought I had left my life and my marriage and my past. Now it seems to have followed me, threatening to destroy my future. Another wave of tears washed over Scarlet as she wept for deceiving Todd. Then your deceit wasn't intentional, but as long as you keep it a secret, it is, Jane reminded her. Come, I'll make you some ginger tea. I've heard it helps with the nausea. Scarlet reached for Jane's hand and met her gaze. I've never had a sister before. Having met you has only brought me joy. Good, because I expect you to do the same for me when the time comes, Jane said with a smile. Chapter 9. 13th of May, 1893, Bicker Ranch, Montana. Scarlet had lain awake all night, trying to find the right words to tell Todd about her condition. But the more she tried to find a way to try and explain to him that she hadn't intentionally deceived him, the more she realized that she had. She should have been honest with him about her marriage to Ned, but when she and Todd had started corresponding, it had only been a friendship. He had simply been a friend who offered her an escape from the horrible marriage and life in which she had been caught up. It didn't matter how she worded it, Todd would feel betrayed, and it would be her fault for hurting him. This morning, she knew she couldn't postpone telling him for a day longer. She was up before dawn and waited to hear movement in the house before she found her way to the kitchen. Jane had just started making breakfast when Scarlet joined her in the kitchen. I've just brewed your tea, Jane said as the scent of ginger filled the kitchen. Thank you so much. It's truly helped, Scarlet said gratefully. Hopefully, if she had a cup of ginger tea before her breakfast, she might avoid her chamber pot today. As they discussed the chores for this morning, nerves tangled in Scarlet's belly. Todd went out every morning to ride the fences before he would return for breakfast. It was then that Scarlet hoped to talk to him. All her plans flew out the window the moment Todd stepped into the cabin a short while later. All the fences on the east are down. Probably a dozen or more head of cattle had been pushed through. Found 5 that had been slaughtered. Of course, they tried to make it look like wolves. Todd was fuming as he set down his hat. No, not again. Jane cried out, rushing to his side. Are you sure it wasn't wolves? Wolves won't drop the fences. They would have taken more cattle, but I think they were interrupted somehow, Todd explained. What do you mean again? Scarlet asked, not sure what had happened or what had happened in the past. It's Lester Wills, Jane said confidently. Ever since he claimed the land to the east of our ranch, he's been trying to force us to sell. The more Todd turns him down, the more he tries to force our hand. You think this Lester Wills stole your cattle? Scarlet asked, turning to Todd. Todd nodded. He's done it before, but he's never harmed my cattle before. He's becoming determined, and clearly he's not afraid to cause harm to my livestock. I want you to keep the shotgun close during the day, Jane. I don't expect him to cause trouble at the cabin, but I want you to be prepared. Jane let out a huff. If he dares come to this door, I'll blow a hole through him. Why does he want your ranch, your land? Scarlet asked, still not understanding. Todd drew in a deep breath before he patiently began to explain. The river runs through my property. He has access to it on 2 pastures of his ranch, but he has to cart water to the other pastures. If he has my land, he has complete control over the river and the best grazing land in the area. Oh my goodness, and this Lester Wills? Is he a mean person? Scarlet asked, feeling a shiver run down her spine. She had met mean men in her life. She knew how they worked. After all, she had been married to one, the meanest you can find. Of course, he doesn't do any of his dirty work by himself. He hires bandits or locals to do it for him, Jane informed her. If Lester has resorted to dropping fences and killing our cattle, then it means he's more determined than ever before. Todd, what are we going to do? Todd shrugged. I don't know, but we'll have to think of something. For now, I think it's best if we double the fence patrols. Yay, Semsen. I might have to hire some more hands to help with that. I'm going to move the cows and calves into the north pasture, and hopefully that will make it a little harder for him to reach them. That's a good idea, Jane agreed. Is there anything I can do? Scarlet offered, feeling helpless. Todd shook his head. Don't go anywhere alone and stay close to the cabin. I've got enough to worry about without having to worry about you too. With that, Todd grabbed his hat and headed out once more. Scarlet turned to Jane and let out a quiet sigh. Todd had enough on his plate at the moment. He didn't need the extra trouble of learning his fiancée was carrying another man's child. She might have been prepared to tell him today, but she would need to wait until a better time presented itself. I wanted to tell him now, Scarlet admitted to Jane. Jane nodded. I could tell. I'm sorry, Scarlet. Lester Wills has been a problem for a long time. I just always believed that eventually he'd give up. I didn't expect him to resort to violence. Do you think he'll harm Todd? Scarlet asked, concerned. Jane shook her head. Todd can take care of himself. I'm more worried about what will happen to Lester if Todd catches him harming his herd. Scarlet nodded, understanding that anger might compromise a man's morals in the moment. She just hoped that anger wouldn't compromise Todd's feelings for her when the time came to tell him the truth. Chapter 10. 24th May 1893, Great Falls, Montana. I don't think this is a good idea, Scarlet said as Jane stopped the wagon in front of the dress shop. Jane turned to her with a firm look. Unless you want your dresses to burst at the seams, we don't really have another choice. With Todd being so consumed with Lester Wills and his antics to get his hands on the Bicker Ranch, Scarlet still hadn't told Todd about her condition. This morning, Jane had insisted they go into town not only to confirm the pregnancy, but to buy Scarlet a couple of dresses bigger in size to hide her growing baby bump. Are you sure the midwife won't tell anyone? Scarlet didn't trust the old woman who had confirmed her pregnancy just a short while before. Jane smiled at Scarlet with a promising look. Sally has been the midwife in this town for years. She takes privacy very seriously. I assure you, you have nothing to worry about. If you say so, Scarlet said with a sigh. What do we tell the women in the dress shop? Obviously, they'll know. I'll help you with the fitting. That way they won't see the baby bump. We'll simply tell them that ranch life has caused you to pick up some weight, Jane said with an easy shrug. And they'll believe you? Scarlet asked, concerned. I'll be convincing, Jane promised. A short while later, they walked into the dress shop where two women styled to perfection greeted them with a smile. Jane, how lovely to see you, and who is this? This is my brother's fiancée, Scarlet Edge, Jane announced proudly. They're to have their wedding in a few months. She's traveled here all the way from Jersey City. Really? I've never been. I'm from Atlanta and she's from Chicago, the smaller of the two women informed Scarlet. It's a pleasure to meet you both. Scarlet greeted them with a smile. What can we do for you today? The second woman asked. Jane turned to the women with a conspiratorial look. Scarlet has spent most of her life on nothing but cheese and a little bread, you see. Since she's come to the ranch, I've fattened her up with a little beef. The only problem is, now her dresses are a little tight. You poor thing. You must be so happy to have escaped that life. Todd is a true gentleman. He'll make a good husband. Thank you, Scarlet said with a surprised smile. She hadn't thought Jane could be so convincing. And don't worry, you're not fat. You just look healthy. A man doesn't want to marry a scarecrow. Come on, I have a few dresses that will work perfectly, the attendant offered as she led them to a rack lined with dresses. Here, let's try these. Would you mind if I help her dress? She's a little shy. Jane took control of the fittings without batting an eye. An hour later, they left the dress shop with 3 new dresses for Scarlet. Scarlet turned to Jane with a baffled expression. You should be in the theater. I know, just a shame we don't have any in Great Falls yet. Jane winked with a smile. Now we're going to the General Mercantile to stock up on some fresh fruits. You heard the midwife. Fruit, that's too expensive. I'm fine with what we have at home, truthfully. Scarlet insisted when Jane's eyes narrowed as she spotted someone across the street. Jane? Scarlet asked, concerned. That's him. Jane nodded towards a sophisticated man on the other side of the thoroughfare. He looks completely innocent, doesn't he? That's just it. He seems innocent and kind and even donates generously to the church, but he's rotten inside. Scarlet didn't have to ask who. She knew that Jane was talking about Lester Wills. I didn't expect someone like that at all. No one does. That's why no one believes the mischief he's up to. I wish they still lynched people in Montana, Jane huffed irritably. Taking a life is never the answer, Scarlet commented, even as she couldn't help but wonder how a man could get away with killing cattle to try and drive another rancher out. How about the sheriff? Can't he help? The sheriff doesn't trust him either, but he hasn't got any proof that it's Lester causing us problems. Jane said as she took the reins. What is Todd going to do? Even with more men riding the fences and watching the cattle, Lester still took another 24 just days ago. Scarlet couldn't help but be concerned for the ranch's future. Although she wasn't yet Todd's wife, she was beginning to think of the ranch as her home as well. I don't know. I'm praying for a miracle, but honestly, I just hope we get one in time, Jane admitted. If he takes half the herd, we won't have any stock to take to auction. That will be the end of the ranch's financial stability. The only choice we'll have then is to sell to him. Scarlet's heart clenched with fear. But that would be letting him win. I know. That's why I'm praying for a miracle, Jane said with a nod. Scarlet wasn't sure what she could do except to be a pillar of strength for Todd during this difficult time, but there was something else she could do. Can you teach me how to shoot the shotgun? Jane turned to her with a surprised expression. Why would you want to learn how to shoot? Scarlet held Jane's gaze. Men like Lester don't stop until they have what they want, and he is going to keep coming until he has it. When he does, I want to know that we can support Todd and the other men. I won't sit at home like a fragile wife while Todd is fighting for the ranch. Jane's laughter filled the air. Spoken like a true rancher's wife, but just remember you are with child. Scarlet nodded. And my child will be proud of me for it. Jane nodded, liking Scarlet's answer. Then I'll teach you, and we'll fight for what's ours. Chapter 11. 27th of May, 1893. Bicker Ranch, Montana. Scarlet couldn't lie to Todd for another minute. Men were usually unobservant when it came to a woman's change in appearance or new clothes, but Todd happened to notice and compliment her on both. The day after she and Jane had gone into town, he had complimented her on her new dress. Scarlet had flushed bright red before she thanked him for the compliment. Then just this morning he commented on her healthy glow. Not knowing what else to say about her flushed cheeks, which were the result of morning sickness, she attributed it to the sun. Scarlet hated lying, especially after her marriage to Ned. And now, here she was doing the exact same thing to Todd. She feared his reaction when he learned of her deceased husband and that she was carrying his child. But she feared what would happen to her soul more if she didn't confess the truth. She sought out Jane after dinner in the kitchen and waited until Todd was out of earshot. Jane, I'm going to do it tonight. I'll make him coffee and join him on the porch, if you don't mind being scarce. Jane's eyes softened as she reached for Scarlet's hands. I wish you the best of luck. I'll pray that my brother's feelings for you are greater than his disappointment might be. Scarlet smiled warmly. I really hope that by tomorrow, you'll still be my future sister-in-law. Jane gave Scarlet an encouraging look as Scarlet began to brew a fresh pot of coffee. While Scarlet waited for the coffee to brew, she became more anxious by the second. She imagined all the worst outcomes her confession might have and feared they would all come true. By the time she poured the coffee, her hands were quivering. What if he kicked her off the ranch tonight? What if he simply walked away without even trying to understand her situation? Good luck, Jane said before she disappeared to her bedroom. Scarlet took the cups and headed outside to the porch where Todd was already seated. Having coffee on the porch had become somewhat of a routine for them. It was the only time of day they had to really talk. Sometimes Jane would join them, but most of the time it would be just the two of them. Coffee? Thank you. Todd smiled as Scarlet set down the cup on the small table between the two rocking chairs. Scarlet held her cup firmly with both hands as she took a seat, afraid that he would notice her quivering hands. Regardless of her attempts to hide her angst, Todd frowned as he turned towards her. Scarlet, is something wrong? You're about as white as a freshly laundered sheet? Scarlet drew in a deep breath before she met his gaze. Todd, there is something I have to tell you. I hope you will hear me out until the very end before you respond. Todd frowned. Scarlet, is something wrong? No, but I do have to tell you something. I wasn't completely truthful in my letters, Scarlet admitted, dropping her gaze to the floor. I'm listening, Todd said patiently. Scarlet gathered all her courage and began to explain. I was married. She heard Todd's soft gasp, but he remained silent, giving her the opportunity to continue. When I read your advertisement, and you said you were only seeking friendship, I was looking for the same. You see, my husband, my marriage, wasn't one of choice. I was forced to marry a criminal kingpin in order to repay my father's debts. It was either that or my father would have paid those debts with his life. Little did I know that he would succumb to bad health shortly after the wedding. She paused for a moment to draw breath and to bite back the tears burning her eyes. You see, I never loved Ned. I was forced into a marriage I didn't want. I was forced to live in a world filled with crime and underworld dealings, while I was treated like an errant child. Writing to you was my way of escaping the horrible nightmare my life had become. I never for a moment thought that our friendship would turn into something more. Scarlet turned her gaze to the star-dusted sky and let out a sigh. But the more we corresponded, the more I wished that I had married a man like you. I tried to divorce Ned once, but he threatened me with my life. Then, shortly before you proposed, I was upstairs one evening when I heard gunshots. Ned was in one of his late-night, early-morning meetings with some of his associates. I rushed downstairs and found him lying dead in a pool of his own blood. I still don't know who was responsible because Ned simply had too many enemies to try and list them to the police. But instead of feeling sadness while standing over his lifeless body, I felt free for the first time. The last thing Scarlet had expected was for Todd to reach for her hand. He took it in his silence and held it as if offering her the support she needed to continue. Ned pretended we had a good life, but I learned after his death that his own debts were just as high. Then I received your letter. It was a ray of hope in the darkness. Finally, I was free to reach for the dream of having a good husband and a family of my own. I didn't hesitate for a moment to accept your proposal, but I feared if I was honest about Ned and his death, that you might have told me not to come. Scarlet shook her head and brushed away a tear. I walked out of the marriage and his home with nothing more than the clothes on my back. But I didn't even care, because I was coming here to you, a man that I had come to know as gracious, kind, patient, and hardworking. Thank you for telling me. I would have preferred to know sooner, but it doesn't make a difference to the feelings that I have for you, Todd said quietly as he squeezed her hand. Scarlet sniffed, struggling to hold back her tears now. That's not all. Todd frowned, but Scarlet didn't hesitate. She continued before she lost the courage to do so. I didn't know until I arrived on the ranch that I was carrying Ned's child. I suspected as much, but it hadn't been confirmed. I went into town earlier this week to see the midwife. She's confirmed that I am indeed with child, Ned's child. Scarlet sniffed and brushed the tears away. I understand if you'd rather have me leave in the morning, just please don't ask me to leave in the dark of night. Todd didn't speak, didn't meet her gaze, and his hand holding hers had become stiff. Scarlet prepared herself for the worst. Chapter 12. Todd kept his silence for a while. When he finally did speak, he was unmoving as he spoke. How far along are you? Scarlet frowned, trying to remember before she answered. 4 months, more or less, according to the midwife, and my last, you know. Todd nodded. That isn't too far along. Scarlet struggled to understand what he meant until her heart clenched with fear. No, I will not go and see the midwife to remove this baby. It's a life from God. Todd turned to her with a frown. You thought I wanted you to have the baby removed? He reached for her other hand and met her gaze. I would never expect that of you. As you said, a baby is a blessing from God. I just meant that it isn't too far along. We still have time to prepare a nursery and get things ready for when the baby arrives. Scarlet's jaw nearly dropped. You mean I can stay? Todd smiled with a nod. Your circumstances were not of your choosing, Scarlet. I did ask for friendship, and I also didn't expect it to become more. Why would I ask you to leave when you have become the one thing in my life that brings me joy? Scarlet's heart soared with his words. You mean that? I do. I never thought I would meet a woman who would be suited to this life, or suited to me, but you suit both. Ever since you arrived at the Bicker Ranch, my feelings for you have grown exponentially. I know it's barely been 6 weeks, but it feels as if I've known you for a lifetime. Just like you see a life with me as an escape from the dreadful life you have, you are my escape from the loneliness that has haunted me. Scarlet leaned her cheek against the back of his hand. Thank you, Todd. You're even more amazing than I realized. There is one problem, though, Todd pointed out. I want to raise that baby as my own. If we're married soon enough, people won't bother about doing the math. Scarlet nodded. I'd like that very much. My baby would be blessed to have you as a father. Good, then it's settled. We'll be married next Saturday, Todd said with a firm smile. Scarlet's eyes widened with surprise. That's only 10 days away. I know, and you've already been here almost 2 months. We'll ask the midwife to say the baby came early, and no one will know the better. Does Jane know? Scarlet nodded ruefully. She figured it out. I didn't tell her. It was she who took me to see the midwife. I figured as much, Todd grinned. Then it will be our secret, along with Jane. Thank you. Scarlet smiled lovingly at Todd. She had feared his reaction, but his acceptance of her past and the child she was carrying was only a testament to the kind of man she had fallen in love with. I love you, Todd. Todd smiled into her gaze and pressed a kiss to the back of her hand. I love you more. A contented silence hung over the porch for a short while before Todd began to chuckle. Scarlet turned to him with a curious look, not understanding what he found so funny. What is it? Todd shook his head. Did you really think I'd throw you off the ranch? I did deceive you, and you're an honest man. I didn't expect you to be so quick to forgive. Todd shrugged with ease. Scarlet frowned and searched his gaze. How blessed I am to have found you. Before I corresponded with you, I believed all men were like Ned, out to get something for themselves, no matter the cost or the harm to others. Todd reached for her hand once more. Before you, I thought all women were nagging, expensive, and more trouble than they were worth, so I guess we're square then. Chapter 13. 8 June 1893, Bicker Ranch, Montana. There were numerous wagons and horses visible from Scarlet's bedroom window as people gathered on the mowed lawn behind the house. Scarlet realized she barely knew anyone. She recognized the midwife, the lady from the dress store, and one of the people who worked at the General Mercantile. Other than that, everyone was unfamiliar to her. But today wasn't about the people that were gathered on the lawn, or about the food that Jane had been preparing since the day before. Today was the day that Scarlet would be saying vows with her heart instead of out of fear. A smile spread across her face as she rested a hand on her belly. Her bump was now a little more visible, but thanks to the dresses Jane had chosen for her, no one would know any better. Excitement and hope coursed through her veins as she slipped on the new dress she had bought the day before. Scarlet had insisted it wasn't necessary to have a new dress, but Todd had insisted that it was. A new dress to start her new future. The dress was pale blue with white pinstripes, coming together as perfectly as a picture with the white sleeves and veil that Jane had surprised her with this morning. Scarlet couldn't remember ever feeling as beautiful or happy. She thought about everything that had brought her to this moment and couldn't feel anything but gratitude. The Lord had truly provided her with a wonderful future, and today she would marry a wonderful husband. Regardless of the tension that hung in the air as they waited for Lester Wills to make his next move, they were going to celebrate their love today in front of everyone Todd knew and cared about. His friends, family, and even other ranchers who had traveled far to join in the celebration. A knock at the door had Scarlet step back from her moment of reminiscence as Jane stepped into the room. "Scarlet, you look beautiful." Scarlet felt a little emotional in response to the compliment. "Thank you, I feel beautiful." "Now you can feel even more beautiful." Jane produced a flower crown that she had been hiding behind her back. "I couldn't resist." Scarlet allowed Jane to put the crown on her head, feeling emotion clogging her throat. "It's magical. Thank you so much, Jane." Scarlet reached for Jane's hands and searched her eyes. "Meeting you has been such a privilege, and after today, to call you family, I don't think you realize how much that means to me. Hopefully one day I can repay you in some way." Jane chuckled. "You already are. You're marrying my brother. He's walking around out there, grinning like a lovesick fool." Scarlet allowed herself a chuckle before she shook her head. "Are they ready yet?" "They're waiting just for you," Jane nodded. Scarlet drew in her breath and let it out steadily before she headed towards the ceremony. Everyone smiled at her warmly as she made her way to Todd. There were a few gasps, a few tears, and emotion filled the air. But it wasn't the kind of emotion Scarlet was used to being surrounded by. Instead of fear, anger, and mistrust, it was love and kindness. The pastor said a few brief words about putting your faith in the Lord and about caring for each other before he had them say their vows. Neither Scarlet nor Todd hesitated for a single moment. When all was said and done, Todd smiled into her eyes. "May I kiss my bride?" Scarlet blushed and the world fell away. "I thought you'd never ask." The kiss was merely a brush of lips, but it meant more than any affection that Ned had ever shown her, because here she felt loved, cherished, and protected. When she opened her eyes, she could see the same love in Todd's gaze. Her heart swelled with joy, knowing that her child would be blessed enough to call this man father. If anything, Scarlet was more grateful for that than anything. The next hour flew by as Scarlet was introduced to so many people that her head began to spin. Luckily, she was saved by Todd, who pulled her aside. "Come, you need to rest a little. Being on your feet all day isn't good for our baby." Her heart could burst when he used the word ours. She happily followed him into the barn where she took a seat on a crate. "You know a lot of people," Todd chuckled. "Not really, but hereabouts, a wedding is a pretty big deal. You invite one person and 10 turn up. I guess some people just need to witness some joy and hope to find some for themselves." "Then I'm glad we could help," Scarlet said before she stifled a yawn. "I don't know why I feel so tired all the time." Todd smiled at her and reached for her hand. "You're growing a life. That's exhausting work. Besides, I'm exhausted from all the people. Can't we send them home?" Scarlet laughed. "We haven't even eaten yet, and Jane has cooked enough for this county and the next." "Then we'll feed them and send them off," Todd said with determination. "Besides, we still need to move your things into my room." Scarlet's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't even thought of that. She had been so consumed with the pregnancy, the wedding, and Lester Wills looming in the back of her mind that she hadn't even considered what life would be like after the wedding. She smiled at Todd and nodded. "Let's feed them and send them on their way." Scarlet had never thought she would be blessed enough to know what true love felt like, but in that moment she knew she was showered with it. Were it not for Lester Wills, there wouldn't have been a single care in her heart. But Lester Wills milled in the back of her mind because she knew men like him. He wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted, and that was the Bicker Ranch. The brief reprieve after his attack on their cattle could only mean one thing. He was preparing for his next move. Scarlet shrugged away the uneasy feeling and followed her husband back to their reception. Chapter 14. 16th of June, 1893, Bicker Ranch, Montana. The can stood atop a rock against the backdrop of the prairie in the distance. To the right was the forest, and to the left were the pastures where the cattle grazed. but neither Jane nor Scarlet were here for the view or the good weather. After a busy morning of chores and canning, Jane had suggested the time had come to teach Scarlet how to use a Winchester rifle. She had been married for a total of 8 days and had never been happier. Her husband was the most amazing man she had ever met, and her baby had begun to nudge her from the inside. Even now, as she looked at the cans, he was tickling her tummy with small nudges and kicks. It was early days yet, but Scarlet already knew that her marriage to Todd would never be anything like her marriage to Ned. He talked to her about anything and everything. He told her about the ranch, about his concerns, and asked about her day. He was concerned about the pregnancy and insisted they do their Bible study together each night when they retired to their room. It was nothing short of magical. Things had been quiet on the Lester Wills front, but Scarlet could see when Todd thought she wasn't looking that he knew what she had guessed. Lester Wills was only quiet because he was plotting his next attack on Todd to win over the ranch. That was why when Jane had suggested they come out to practice shooting, Scarlet hadn't hesitated. She would protect the ranch, this family, and her unborn baby with her life if she had to. Regardless of the back pain she had from standing all morning, she eagerly agreed and helped to set up the cans. Right, the rifle is safe now, which means it isn't loaded. Here, take it. Jane handed Scarlet the rifle, and Scarlet held it as if it were a live snake. Jane's laughter echoed in the air. It won't bite. I know. I've just never held one, Scarlet admitted. Well, now you have. Remember, when you're holding it, you're holding someone's life in your hands. And always remember, your life is more important, Jane explained seriously. Scarlet nodded and listened intensively as Jane took the rifle back and explained the different parts. She briefly skimmed over cleaning and maintaining the rifle before she demonstrated how to load it. This time, she didn't hand it back to Scarlet, but instead took aim at one of the cans. See here, Jane explained as she aimed. You have to line up these notches and keep it steady against your shoulder. That way, when you pull the trigger and it recoils, your shoulder absorbs the impact. If you don't, you might give yourself a blue eye, or worse. Worse? Scarlet asked, horrified. Well, I've seen a man or two without front teeth because they thought steadying the rifle wasn't necessary. Only if you're practiced at shooting, you can try and aim with one hand, but even then you're taking a risk because we're not as strong as men. Scarlet nodded and positioned the rifle as Jane explained. She drew in a deep breath and let it out before she squeezed the trigger. She couldn't believe it when a can flew off the rock. I did it! Jane clapped her hands, joining in the excitement of the moment. Scarlet couldn't believe how powerful and triumphant she felt as she turned to Jane with a smile almost a mile wide. I can't believe I made the shot, Jane laughed. Beginner's luck? Want to try it again? This time, with Jane's supervision, Scarlet reloaded the rifle. She took aim and repeated the same process before she squeezed the trigger. Another can flew off the rock. She turned to Jane with a cocky look and a teasing grin. Beginner's luck or a natural gunslinger? Jane's laughter floated on the air. You percent. Definitely a natural gunslinger. Todd is going to be very impressed. Scarlet was about to say something when a sharp pain took hold of her abdomen. Ouch! She had the sense to pass the rifle to Jane before she collapsed onto the ground. Scarlet, Jane asked, setting down the gun and crouching by her side. What is it? Is it the baby? I don't know, Scarlet said through clenched teeth as the pain ripped through her body once more. It hurts. Oh dear, I can't carry you. Let me fetch Todd. Jane raced towards the barn where Todd and his men had just returned. Scarlet lay on the dirt, glancing up at the cloudless indigo sky, and prayed for her baby's safety. She did not have experience with pregnancy, but surely a sharp pain like this couldn't be good. God, please protect my baby. Please don't let any harm come its way. Please, God, I beg of you. I will raise this baby in your name and honor you with every breath I take. Just please don't let me lose my baby. Scarlet felt tears roll over her cheeks as she heard the footsteps rush towards her. Scarlet? Todd cried out as he neared her. Scarlet didn't try and speak, but instead just slipped an arm around her husband's neck as he scooped her up in his arms. Commands were given for the midwife to be called and for the horses to be stabled, even as he carried her towards the cabin. He lay her down on their bed and brushed the hair from her brow. "The midwife will be here soon." Scarlet nodded, feeling weak and fragile as she lay curled up in bed with the pain. She wasn't sure if she passed out or fell asleep, but the next thing she heard was the midwife's voice. "Let me at her, all of you out." Scarlet tried to push herself up in bed, but she was simply too weak. "You look as pale as a sheet," the midwife commented as she began to probe Scarlet's abdomen. The midwife's assessment didn't take more than 5 minutes before she opened the door and called for Todd and Jane. Scarlet's eyes were wide with fear. "Is it the baby? Is it all right?" The midwife let out a sigh before she nodded. "The baby is just fine, but it won't be if you don't slow down." "But I wasn't even that busy," Scarlet argued. "Being on your feet for most of the day isn't ideal. Apart from that, it seems you have an iron deficiency. It's common amongst women with child. It's the baby tapping you of all your nutrients, which means you need to take in more than usual. From here on out, I want you to eat meat at least twice a day, and you need to take it easier on yourself. If you were on your feet for an hour, I expect you to rest for an hour." The midwife spoke as if Scarlet was an errant child. "I'll make sure she gets the nutrients and the meat that she needs. I assure you this won't happen again." "I won't let anything happen to Scarlet or our baby," Todd said, stepping forward. The midwife smiled warmly at Todd. "I'm sure you will, Todd." Todd followed the midwife out, no doubt having a talk with her about lying about the baby's date of conception, leaving Jane and Scarlet alone. "This is all my fault," Jane said with a heavy sigh. "It isn't. Neither you nor I could have known that I was overdoing it today. Now that we know, I won't make the same mistake. This baby is a blessing, and I won't let any harm come to it. That I know for certain, especially after I saw you shoot a rifle," Jane teased. Todd returned with a curious look. "You let Scarlet shoot the rifle? I thought you were the one doing the shooting?" Jane shook her head. "Your wife here is a natural gunslinger, hit 2 cans in a row." Todd nodded, clearly impressed. "Well, just don't do anything else for the rest of the day. The midwife said it would be best if you rested for a day or two before you were back on your feet." Scarlet's eyes widened with horror. "But I'm not sick. Your body is tired. Growing a baby is hard work. You need to rest. For me and for our baby." How could Scarlet argue with that? Chapter 15. 25th of June, 1893. Bicker Ranch, Montana. Scarlet placed the freshly baked bread on the table, enjoying the scent it brought to the table, along with the stew she had prepared for lunch. Jane had left for town a few hours ago, and Todd had gone to check on his cattle and his fences. She didn't enjoy being cooped up inside and being watched like a hawk, but it felt good to be cared for. The last time Scarlet experienced what it felt like to be loved and cherished was before her father had passed away. She set out the preserves that Jane had stored in the pantry from the last canning season, along with butter they had churned the week before. It was then that Jane walked through the front door. Before she even greeted her, Scarlet could see that something was wrong. "Hello, sorry it took me so long. You should be resting, not cooking." Jane scolded when she noticed the table. "I can't spend the rest of my pregnancy on my back. Besides, I was planning on taking a rest this afternoon. How was your trip to town? Is something wrong?" Scarlet asked, trying to figure out what had caused the frown on her sister-in-law's brow. "It's nothing," Jane lied as she set down the purchases. The front door opened once more, and Todd's heavy footfall entered the house. "I hope Jane prepared lunch," he said without greeting her, also wearing a frown with an invisible weight on his shoulders. Scarlet held her silence while Jane and Todd bickered about Scarlet needing to rest. She interrupted them when they began to plan making turns to watch her. "Just hold on a minute. I'm pregnant, not an invalid or a child. I can feel when my body needs rest, and you have to trust me to listen to it. I won't be coddled or watched or told to spend the next few months in bed. Now, before you try to think of another way to wrap me in cotton wool, why are both of you upset? Jane, it's clear something happened in town, and Todd, you look as if you had a run-in with a grizzly." Scarlet propped her hands on her hips with a questioning look. Jane shook her head. "It's nothing." You're imagining things, Todd countered as well. Scarlet let out a frustrated sigh. Stop coddling me, she all but cried out. Jane was the first to break. I didn't want to upset you or Todd, for that matter, but there are some rumors circulating in town. What rumors? Todd asked, stepping forward. It seems word is out on your pregnancy, Jane began with a heavy sigh. Probably because we sent for the midwife last week. But that's not all. I can't think of anyone else that would start such a horrid rumor. But word is in town that the baby's father is a ranch hand. Todd cursed under his breath. Does that man have no boundaries when it comes to defaming the name of a lady? Apparently not. Scarlet sighed, shaking her head. Todd, your turn. Todd shrugged. We're short a few head of cattle. How many? Scarlet asked without hesitation, even as her heart began to race. If Lester Wills didn't stop stealing their cattle, there wouldn't be anything to ranch with. About 10, maybe 12. We're doing a recount of the herd in the north pasture this afternoon. Todd grumbled under his breath. Scarlet glanced at Jane and then at Todd. She realized they were trying to protect her, but she didn't need their protection. Men like Lester Wills use these types of tactics to scare you. Don't let them win by backing down. We know the truth about the baby, so the rumors don't matter. Perhaps if you can afford it, you should hire more wranglers to watch the herd. Todd glanced at his sister before a smile curved his mouth. You seem to be very clear-headed about all of this. Scarlet nodded. We have to be if we're going to weather this storm. Being frightened and angry only clouds your judgment. You sound like you're speaking from experience? Jane asked softly. Scarlet nodded. More than I'd like to admit. Lester thinks that he's breaking you slowly, using rumors and cattle theft to force you to sell to him. Instead of reacting to his actions, you need to be preparing for his next onslaught. Then we'll prepare. Todd nodded in agreement before he stepped closer and took Scarlet's hand. I'm sorry about the rumors. They don't matter because they're lies. You know the truth, and that's all that matters. Can we please eat before lunch gets cold? Not all of us here have someone to snuggle up to? Jane retorted with a teasing smile. Scarlet stepped away from Todd and nodded. Let's eat. Chapter 16. 6th of July, 1893, Great Falls, Montana. Scarlet had insisted on going into town with Jane. She couldn't sit at home and watch the leaves fall, knowing that both Jane and Todd had too much on their minds. If someone wanted to bother Jane with their rumors today, they would have to deal with her first. On the drive into town, Scarlet enjoyed the sights and sounds of town. Although it was far from the bustling of Jersey City, it was still much busier than life on the ranch. She realized how much she had come to appreciate the calm and quiet of ranch life. The steady chores and the company of her new family had come to be her new normal, a new normal she had dreamed of since she could remember. First stop is at the Mercantile. You're welcome to wait in the wagon, Jane said as she brought the wagon to a stop. Scarlet shook her head. And miss out on the latest rumors about my illicit affairs? Never. She joined Jane and tucked her arm through the crook of Jane's elbow. As they walked into the Mercantile store, Scarlet couldn't help but feel a little nervous. She pushed her nerves aside and instead thwarted any rumors about her pregnancy by announcing it. I wonder if the baby is going to be a boy or a girl. I've always wanted a baby girl, but I know a little boy that looks like Todd will simply fill my heart with joy. She felt Jane stiffen beside her and continued. We'll have to start knitting clothes and blankets, and goodness, Todd will have to decide if he can build a crib or if we need to order one from back east. I think Todd will want to build his baby's crib, Jane joined in with a teasing grin. I think so too, Scarlet agreed, feeling her sister-in-law relax a little. After getting everything they needed from the Mercantile, Jane had 2 more stops to make. Scarlet was feeling a little exhausted after the act she had delivered seamlessly and chose to wait in the wagon at their next stop. Jane had barely disappeared into the fabric store when a little boy ran up to the wagon. For you, ma'am. Scarlet smiled at the boy and accepted the note he offered her. She opened the note, and her heart stilled as she began to read. She didn't have a single doubt in her mind about who the note was from or that it had been written in a hurry. it still sent chills traveling down her spine. You might fool the rest of this town with your happy family act, but I know the truth. I know that baby isn't Todd Bickers, and I also know that unless your loving husband sells his land, a war is coming his way. Are you the type of mother who will endanger a baby when the war ensues? You don't fool me. Run, little rabbit, run. Scarlet crumpled the note into a ball when Jane came out of the store carrying a paper bag. I bought green, yellow, and white wool. No use going for blue or pink if we don't know if it's a boy or a girl. Clever thinking. Scarlet smiled, although her heart was racing a mile a minute. If there had been any doubt in her mind that Lester Wills was anything like Ned, it had now disappeared. Lester Wills would go to any length to obtain the Bicker Ranch, and clearly threats weren't beneath him. For a moment, she considered telling Jane about the note and decided against it. Both Jane and Todd had enough on their minds already, without worrying about veiled threats. She would burn it in the fireplace tonight, but she knew the words would haunt her for days to come. Where was the law in all of this? Couldn't the sheriff stop Lester Wills? Surely he couldn't just bully everyone into selling their land. She remembered Ned and his late-night dealings and realized she was wrong. A bully like Lester Wills could get anything he wanted. They were usually smart and tough enough to know how to get exactly what they wanted without having the law even blink. As they drove back to the ranch, she leaned back against the seat and closed her eyes as she soaked up the sun. She wouldn't let the likes of Lester Wills get her down, and she wouldn't allow his note to upset her or her baby. If a war was coming to Bicker Ranch, Lester Wills had another thing coming. This might be the Wild West, but she wasn't going to hide beneath the dining table. She would stand side by side with her husband, armed with a rifle and ready to defend her family and their land. She would just have to pray that the Lord gave her the courage she needed for when that day came. Chapter 17. Scarlet, dear, you barely said a word all night long. Are you feeling ill? Todd asked that evening once he and Scarlet were alone in their room. Scarlet sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the distance. No, I'm perfectly fine. Then why do I have a feeling that you're not? You told me not to shield you from anything, and now you're the one holding back, Todd asked as he took a seat beside her. Scarlet let out a heavy sigh. You have enough on your mind without me bothering you about silly little notes. What notes? Todd asked. I'll decide if it's silly or not. Just threats from Lester Wills. Nothing new. A boy gave it to me in town today. He says a war is coming to the Bicker Ranch if you don't sell it to him. That I will be a bad mother for putting my baby in harm's way by staying here. I know it's just his way of trying to get you to sell, so I don't understand why it's bothering me. Todd gently rested a hand on her belly. Because you're a mother now and you're not worried for yourself, you're worried for your child. I won't let anything happen to you or the baby, Todd promised reassuringly. I know that, but men like him, my husband Ned was the same. He won't stop, Todd. Not until he's broken you or this ranch enough for you to give up on everything. That day will never come, Todd said with a hint of aggression. I'd rather bleed on the dirt than gallop away from it. This is my family's ranch, and no one can take it from me. They're already taking the cattle, Scarlet noted quietly. Todd nodded. I know. I'm thinking of a plan to avoid that. But right now, I don't want you to worry about Lester Wills or his threats. You need your rest. Scarlet turned to Todd with a loving smile. Whatever did I do to deserve a husband as loving and caring as you? I ask myself the same every single day about you. We just found each other, Scarlet. Don't let this scoundrel ruin anything for us. I won't, Scarlet promised. A short while later, Todd was fast asleep, but sleep wouldn't arrive for Scarlet. She tossed and turned until she finally gave up on sleep altogether. She gathered the knitting yarn that Jane had placed in a basket by the fireplace and began to knit a blanket for her baby. Faith had always been her sanctuary during difficult times, and tonight she sought that sanctuary. As she slipped the wool over the needles, she began to pray for strength, courage, endurance, and faith. Scarlet allowed herself to remember all the worst times in her life and how God had led her through those troubled waters to the shore. She remembered the day of her wedding, when she wept and prayed for God to release her from the life she was about to enter. Scarlet remembered the first time Ned scolded her like an errant child and told her to remain out of sight when anyone was there to see him. She was taken back to the day that her father passed away shortly after her wedding and wondered what God's purpose was for her life, crying over his grave and wondering if she would ever be able to escape the debt she had to pay on her father's behalf. Every single time, God had given her the strength and the courage to stand tall. He had given her endurance and patience and had comforted her with the knowledge that he had a plan for her life. When she left Jersey, she truly believed that her purpose was entwined with Todd Bickers. But now that she was faced once more with nothing more than a bull-headed, stubborn, and conniving bully, she couldn't help but wonder if her life would ever be free of such turmoil. As if God could hear her every thought, he gave her a verse from the Bible to strengthen her resolve once more. She remembered the verse as if she had just read it between the covers of her Bible, although she knew she had never laid her eyes on it before. Isaiah 41:10. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. It felt as if a blanket of comfort and assurance settled over her shoulders. Scarlet sank into the feeling and let the knitting needles rest on her lap as she savored the moment. Feeling rejuvenated with courage, hope, and faith, Scarlet resumed knitting, knowing that God would protect her and her baby, as well as her family. The Neds and Lesters of this world would always be there, fueled by hate, envy, and greed, but God would always be there to defend her. It was time she stopped defending herself, and time for her to allow God to lead her actions and her thoughts. The first thought that came to mind was the rumor that was making the rounds in town. She wouldn't lie about the baby's parentage, but she would set the record straight. There was no shame in carrying a baby that was conceived during her marriage to Ned. It was time the people of Great Falls realized that. Chapter 18. 9th July 1893, Wilson Ranch, Montana. Todd had checked his fences and tallied his cattle before he rode out that morning. Leaving his head ranch hand in charge of guarding the cattle, he left the ranch on horseback. He planned on being back before nightfall, but the prospect of the long day ahead didn't bother him in the least. He looked forward to the long ride ahead, without any interruptions. With Lester Wills and his threats constantly on his mind, Todd needed a little time to himself to clear his head and finalize the plan he had devised over the last 2 days. It wasn't a way to get Lester Wills to back off from buying his ranch, but it was a way to remove some of the leverage Lester had over him. The wind felt warm on his face as the sun warmed his back. He was headed to see his neighbor's neighbor. Sam Tucker had been a good friend of the Bicker family for decades. Their families had settled in Great Falls around the same time and had both grown successful cattle ranches. When needed, they would share bulls and trade cows to mix up their bloodlines, ensuring the success of both ranches. He wasn't sure if his relationship with Sam was strong enough to warrant the favor he was going to ask today, but he hoped it would be. It was at least a good 12 miles away, but Todd enjoyed the journey. When he finally trotted up to the barn, he saw Sam talking to a wrangler by the water trough. "Well, I'll be." Sam trailed off, lifting the brim of his hat. "If it ain't Todd Bicker coming to pay me a visit?" Todd chuckled as he slid off the horse. "Ain't a visit exactly, but it's good to see you, Sam." "Come up to the house. The missus just made fresh lemonade this morning," Sam offered as he led Todd towards the porch. They talked a little about the weather and politics, as one did after not seeing each other for a while before they were seated on the porch with a glass of lemonade. "Well, I know you ain't one to ride out all this way to shoot the breeze. What's on your mind, Todd?" Todd nodded and gathered his courage and hope before he began. "Lester Wills." He didn't have to say another word to have Sam nod in commiseration. "I've heard he is out to get your ranch. Is it true your pretty new wife is carrying a wrangler's baby?" Todd fisted his hands at his sides. "No, it ain't true. She fell pregnant before her husband passed. I asked her to marry me anyway. I'll raise the babe as my own." Todd revealed the truth. "That's mighty courageous of you, Todd. But then I haven't known a Bicker to be anything else. That's part of the reason I've come to see you today. Lester's been scrounging off my herd, knowing that without my herd, I won't have anything to live on for the next year. He's spreading rumors about Scarlet and making our lives nothing short of hell. I've thought of hiring extra wranglers, but this late in the season, I don't know who I can trust. My bet is that most of the wranglers hanging around the saloon work for Lester Wills in some way or other." "I think your bet is right," Sam agreed. "I can't lose any more cattle, Sam, and you know I can't lose the ranch." "I ain't selling it either," Todd said simply. "What do you need from me? I'll help whichever way I can," Sam offered. Todd smiled with relief. "That's what I was hoping you'd say. I need to hide my herd." "It won't be easy hiding that many cattle," Sam chuckled. "I want to drive them to the Tucker Ranch in the dark of night. We can use the trail we drove the cattle east on last year. That way only one other person will know my cattle are grazing your land, and that's the neighbor between us." "We can trust old Henry," Sam nodded. "That's what I thought. I just need the herd out of sight until things have calmed down. If you'd rather I sell them to you and buy them back later, I'll try and manage that instead," Todd suggested. Sam shook his head. "How many wranglers you got?" "I got about 5 I can trust. If you can get 5 more, we can drive them here tomorrow night. The only thing I ask in return is that, if this thing with Lester doesn't go down as you hope it does, I get the first option to buy your herd and an option on the land." A bitter taste filled Todd's mouth. He didn't want to sell his herd or his land, but if that was the only option he had left, he'd rather sell to Sam than give Lester more of a foothold in Great Falls. "It's a deal, but I'll be coming for my cattle soon." Sam laughed. "I thought you'd say that." They each spat into the palm of their hands before they shook on it. A deal was a deal, and Todd knew that Sam wouldn't back out or betray him. "With the cattle out of the way, how do you intend to get Lester to back down?" Sam asked curiously. Todd glanced off into the distance. "I haven't thought of that part yet. First, I needed to secure our future." "You don't have to think about that part. Just turn it over to God. He'll help you find a way to get Lester off your backs," Sam assured him. Todd smiled, grateful that he had made the journey to see an old friend. Sam was right. He needed to rely on God and trust that God had his future and his wellness at heart. Once he turned his troubles over to the Lord, he knew that the rest would simply fall into place. Chapter 19. 11th of July, 1893, Great Falls, Montana. Scarlet and Jane were still sitting on the porch when the sun began to rise in the east. Neither of them had slept a wink all night. After learning of Todd's plan to drive the cattle to the Tucker Ranch, both had been too nervous to even attempt sleep. Scarlet couldn't help but fear that Lester and his men would ambush the cattle drive and take the herd, or worse, open fire on Todd and his 5 trusted wranglers and stop them from making it to the Tucker Ranch in the first place. "You need to go and lie down. You've been up all night," Jane said with a yawn. Scarlet shook her head. "You're the tired one. You go and lie down. I know I won't sleep a wink until I know that Todd is home and the cattle are safe." She had barely finished her sentence when she saw 6 riders in the distance. Her heart leaped with joy as she recognized Todd as one of those in the saddle. "There! There they are!" Jane was on her feet in an instant, hooting with joy. "Thank goodness they're back." They stood and watched as Todd and his wranglers closed the distance between them. When Todd finally stepped onto the porch, Scarlet welcomed him back with an embrace. "Welcome home." He hugged her before he stepped back and searched her face. "You haven't slept. Neither of us have. We were waiting to make sure everything went smoothly," Jane said by his side. "The cattle are at Sam's in his northeast pasture. No one will even know they're there," Todd said with relief. "That's wonderful." Jane smiled relieved. "Now I can go to bed." "No, not yet," Scarlet said as an idea formed in her mind. "Jane, if you want to know something about someone in town, who would you go to?" "You mean who is the town gossip?" Jane asked, slightly confused. "Exactly. Who would you call the town gossip?" "Agatha Smith," Jane and Todd said in unison. Jane laughed. She's the mercantile's wife. She knows everything about anyone. Then before we sleep, we're going to the mercantile. Scarlet walked over to the sugar canister and poured the sugar out into the dustbin. We're out of sugar. Todd frowned and shook his head. I have no idea what you're up to, and I'm too tired to even ask. You go take a bath and rest some. We won't be long. Scarlet assured her husband. Almost an hour later, Scarlet hadn't yet explained her mysterious plan to Jane when they stopped in front of the mercantile store. What is going on? Jane asked, perplexed. We need sugar, don't we? Scarlet asked with an innocent smile. Jane let out a puff of frustration as she followed Scarlet into the store. Scarlet bit her tongue hard enough for tears to flood her eyes, so that by the time they walked into the store, her cheeks were covered with tears. Scarlet? Jane asked with genuine concern. What's wrong? Scarlet sniffed loudly as she came to a stop in front of the cashier. Oh, it's nothing really. I just hate knowing about the awful rumors that have been spread about my innocent baby. Jane rested an arm around Scarlet's shoulder. The rumors don't matter. We know the truth. But it does matter. I don't want my baby to be ostracized when it arrives, and with word traveling on the street, that is bound to happen. A wrangler. Can you believe? A wrangler's baby. Scarlet, don't upset yourself. It's not good for the baby. Scarlet could see the curiosity on the cashier's face. Wanting to harness it a little more, she turned directly to her. I'm sorry to bother you, but do you have a handkerchief? Of course, Agatha said, handing one to Scarlet in an instant. I couldn't help but overhear some of the rumors you just mentioned. I thought it was the God-honest truth. Scarlet sniffed daintily. That I would betray Todd by sleeping with his wranglers? Clearly, you don't know me very well. Then whose baby is it? You and Todd haven't been married for that long? Agatha's curiosity knew no end. But today, Scarlet had the world's patience with the gossip. I was married before I even met Todd. When my husband passed away, Todd graciously invited me to come and stay with them for a while, as a friend. I only learned about the baby after coming to Great Falls. I don't know when or how it happened, but Todd and I fell in love. He's offered to raise the baby as his own. Jane finally caught on to the act. One would think that the people of this town knew Todd better than to spread such nonsense. He's an honorable man, not the blind fool he's being made out to be. You're right. Todd's never been anything but kind. Agatha reached over the counter for Scarlet's hand. Don't you worry, darling. I'll make sure the record is set straight. Agatha frowned and thought for a moment before she leaned closer over the counter. I don't mean to pry, Jane, but is it true that the Bicker Ranch is having some troubles? I don't want to spread any rumors, but I have heard talk about you selling out to Lester Wills. Agatha said the name as if poison had just touched her tongue. Jane and Scarlet shared a brief look before Jane answered. It isn't true. Just like Lester Wills spread the rumors about Scarlet's baby, he wants everyone to think that we're down on our luck and he's doing us a favor by buying us out. Truth is, he's been hassling us for months now. Of course, we ain't got no proof, but it is a little coincidental that he knows about every head of Bicker cattle that's been stolen without Todd coming to the sheriff once. Don't you think? Then there are the notes he's been passing Scarlet here, threatening her baby, cutting our fences. I don't even want to go into the nightmare our lives have become. I've never liked the look of him. Thought he was a little too smooth to be true. Just like good whiskey. If it's too good, it'll smack you the next morning. You say he's hassling you? Agatha asked, to be clear. Scarlet didn't hold back. Sensing that Agatha was the type of woman who could rally a community, she told Agatha everything. By the time she had finished, Agatha was astounded and clearly sympathetic. This ain't right. A man like that shouldn't be allowed to live in our town. And now he's just waiting to kick us off the Bicker Ranch, Jane added for good measure. Not if I can stop it, Agatha said firmly. Give me a day or two and come see me again. I think we can deal with the likes of Lester Wills in a way that won't bring harm to anyone. Goal achieved. Scarlet smiled in return. Thank you so much. Actually, we need sugar. Could you ring that up for me? No, for you. This pound is free. You should be thinking about your little one, not worrying about the gossip. Agatha handed Scarlet the sugar, and Scarlet and Jane left. As soon as they were seated in the wagon once more, Jane turned to her with a curious look. "Why didn't you tell me that you planned on doing that?" "I was afraid you wouldn't agree, or worse, you wouldn't act as surprised as you did when you realized I was crying." Jane laughed. "Well, mission accomplished. And we have the sugar, so let's head on home and get some much-needed rest." "What do you think Agatha meant by a plan?" Jane asked as she took the reins. Sture sent. "I have no idea, but I have a feeling with her on our side, the whole town just might stand with us against that bully," Scarlet replied hopefully. Chapter 20. 19th of July, 1893, Bicker Ranch, Montana. Walking the thoroughfare in town, it would seem as if everything was normal in Great Falls. The stores were open, there were men on the street, children playing on side roads, and even a few chickens happily clucking along. But if you looked a little closer, you would realize it was the fragile, the young, or the inexperienced that were left to man the town. Because ever since dawn, every single willing person had crawled into the back of a tarp-covered wagon and headed to the Bicker Ranch. With the help of Scarlet, Jane, and their new ally, Agatha, word had been spread about Todd having to move all his cattle into his southwest pasture due to the risk posed by coyotes in the northern pastures. Word had spread like wildfire through the small town, making sure news of the entire herd's movement reached the right set of ears. After Todd had received another veiled threat, he had known that tonight would be the night that Lester Wills and his bandit wranglers came for his entire herd. The thought caused a hollow pit to form in his stomach, even as he looked at Scarlet and Jane, each carrying a rifle through the dark. Their planning had been detailed, everything from sneaking support out of town onto the ranch, right down to having enough firepower and the sheriff on their side for the onslaught they expected tonight. Lester Wills might think that he was in control and that tonight he would be able to call himself a cattle baron, but he had another thing coming. All around him, the town's townspeople hid in bushes, behind rocks, and even up in the trees. The sheriff and his men were lying low near the fence line, even as a few other ranchers guarded the flanks with their rifles. There was a full moon out, making it easy to walk in the dark, but difficult to hide from plain view. If everything went according to plan, Lester Will's reign of terror would come to an end in Great Falls tonight. He left Scarlet behind a large bush, at least 200 yards from the fence line, and did the same with Jane a few yards closer. He knew they wouldn't listen to reason and stay home, but at least he could try and keep them out of harm's way. As Todd took his own place, lying low in the middle of his pasture, he thanked the Lord for the community's support. He hadn't known that so many people wanted Lester Wills out of town, or how many people had been subjected to his merciless bullying. It had only now come to light that Lester Wills had been demanding security payments from most of the businesses on the thoroughfare. It wasn't a coincidence that he showed up offering protection on the day after masked bandits robbed a business. One thing Todd could admit was that Lester was creative at earning an income. The only problem was he didn't lift a finger for it. He would rather connive, steal, and cheat than work an honest day. With his face turned up to the sky and his rifle in his hand, he looked at the stars and prayed that there would be no gunfire on his ranch tonight. He had just finished his prayer when he heard the sound of at least a dozen galloping horses. Todd held his breath, knowing that they were only minutes from executing their plan. Now all he could do was wait. Chapter 21. Jessup, Anderson, Twait, you go round left and gather up the herd. Lester Wills's voice could be heard as clear as a coyote's call in the still of the night. Todd had known Lester would be overseeing his men tonight. The stakes were too high for it to be spoiled. "Blaze, what you waiting for? Cut those fences," Lester cried out. Todd angled his head just enough to see a man crouch beside his fence. He wanted to jump up and confront the man, but he kept his position, waiting for the sheriff's command. He heard as 4 lines of wire were cut before the sheriff bellowed over the fields. "Lester Wills, along with every one of you standing there, are under arrest for the attempted theft of cattle and trespassing." The sheriff stepped out of the shadows, and his regular deputies, along with a few men he had deputized for the occasion, all moved toward the fence. Lester laughed. Arrest? You can't arrest me, Sheriff. We're friends. Besides, we ain't stealing cattle. We were just lost. Ain't we, men? All his wranglers agreed with him, although Todd could see hesitation in at least two. We ain't friends, Lester. You're like the cockroach that lives in my outhouse. I tolerate you simply because I haven't had the opportunity to squash you yet. I got 13 men, Sheriff. I think you're outnumbered and more than a little out of your league. Lester cocked a revolver and aimed it directly at the sheriff. Todd didn't hesitate for another second. He was on his feet and jogging towards the fence line. He's got one more on his side. And another. One more here. We're 5. We're 2. Another one here. One by one, people stepped out of the shadows and joined the sheriff's side. Before long, Lester and his men were surrounded by everyone he had ever threatened or wronged. What's this? Lester asked with a weak chuckle. You think you can intimidate me? Nope, the sheriff shook his head. But I can arrest you, and I have the manpower to do that, or you could just leave. Lester's eyes widened. You're kicking me out of town? You're leaving tonight, Wills, either on the back of your own horse or in the back of my wagon. But one way or another, you ain't stepping foot in Great Falls again. We have enough firepower here to make sure you never step foot anywhere ever again. You've threatened, intimidated, and bullied enough of the townsfolk to have all of them want to take aim at you. The sheriff shrugged. Choice is yours. For the first time, Todd noticed Lester hesitated before he spoke. His eyes scanned the group of people, and he was clearly surprised how many had turned against him. You can't just shoot me. That's against the law. Blackmail is against the law. Stealing cattle is against the law. Defaming someone's name is against the law. People called out from all around Todd all the laws that Lester had broken in their eyes. We could just shoot the lot of you and say you fired first. The sheriff shrugged as if considering it a valid option. Lester was clearly shocked by the words, as his horse picked up on it and began to nicker as he took a few steps back. If I leave, you're going to shoot me in the back, ain't you? The sheriff shook his head. Ain't worth wasting a bullet. You leave and never come back. I won't waste that bullet. But if you do come back, I'll make sure that every bullet in town is embedded in your flesh, without consequence to who fired it. As if realizing that he was out of options and outnumbered, Lester whistled to his men. No words were spoken as all his bandit wranglers followed him when he rode out. They headed in a westerly direction for as far as the eye could see. No one said a single word as they watched the devil named Lester ride off into the dark. When their shadows disappeared on the horizon, it was as if everyone let out a sigh of relief in unison. The sheriff's laughter could be heard over the valley as he turned to Todd. That was much easier than I anticipated. Shows you what a force of manpower can do to intimidate a bully. Scarlet said, stepping up to his side. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. I can't express how much it means to me and my family to have had your support. If you ever need anything, you know where to find me, Todd said to the people gathered around him. We need to thank you. We had no way of kicking him out of town until you gave us a plan, the owner of the laundry said. Tell you what, Saturday, y'all come out to the Bicker Ranch, and I'll grill us up some beef. We'll have old Pete play his banjo and dance a little and celebrate the community we have right here in Great Falls. That sounds like a grand plan. The sheriff sounded pleased. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to get some sleep. The sheriff was about to leave when he turned to Todd with a curious look. Where are your cattle? I thought they were all here in this pasture? Todd shrugged. Made sure that he couldn't get to my cattle, even if he could get to me. Clever thinking. The sheriff nodded his approval. One by one, everyone began walking back towards the wagons and horses they had arrived with, but Todd lingered behind, taking Scarlet's hand. If it hadn't been for your courage, I don't think I would have been brave enough to go through with this. Scarlet shook her head and smiled at him with love. His heart simply melted at how beautiful she was in the moonlight. If it hadn't been for you, I would have still been in Jersey living a life I hated. Now we can build a new future together. Todd nodded. "But first, I need to drive the cattle back to where they belong. After some sleep, that is." Scarlet nudged him in the ribs. Their laughter mingled as they walked back towards the cabin. The first rays of dawn had just touched the horizon, and for Todd, they didn't only symbolize a new day, but the start of a new chapter in Great Falls, without the fear of Lester Wills hanging over them like a dark cloud. Walking the thoroughfare in town, it would seem as if everything was normal in Great Falls. The stores were open, there were men on the street, children playing on side roads, and even a few chickens happily clucking along. But if you looked a little closer, you would realize it was the fragile, the young, or the inexperienced that were left to man the town. Because ever since dawn, every single willing person had crawled into the back of a tarp-covered wagon and headed to the Bicker Ranch. With the help of Scarlet, Jane, and their new ally, Agatha, word had been spread about Todd having to move all his cattle into his southwest pasture due to the risk posed by coyotes in the northern pastures. Word had spread like wildfire through the small town, making sure news of the entire herd's movement reached the right set of ears. After Todd had received another veiled threat, he had known that tonight would be the night that Lester Wills and his bandit wranglers came for his entire herd. The thought caused a hollow pit to form in his stomach, even as he looked at Scarlet and Jane, each carrying a rifle through the dark. Their planning had been detailed. Everything from sneaking support out of town onto the ranch, right down to having enough firepower and the sheriff on their side for the onslaught they expected tonight. Lester Wills might think that he was in control and that tonight he would be able to call himself a cattle baron. But he had another thing coming. All around him, the town's townspeople hid in bushes, behind rocks, and even up in the trees. The sheriff and his men were lying low near the fence line, even as a few other ranchers guarded the flanks with their rifles. There was a full moon out, making it easy to walk in the dark, but difficult to hide from plain view. If everything went according to plan, Lester Wills's reign of terror would come to an end in Great Falls tonight. He left Scarlet behind a large bush, at least 200 yards from the fence line, and did the same with Jane, a few yards closer. He knew they wouldn't listen to reason and stay home, but at least he could try and keep them out of harm's way. As Todd took his own place, lying low in the middle of his pasture, he thanked the Lord for the community's support. He hadn't known that so many people wanted Lester Wills out of town, or how many people had been subjected to his merciless bullying. It had only now come to light that Lester Wills had been demanding security payments from most of the businesses on the thoroughfare. It wasn't a coincidence that he showed up offering protection on the day after masked bandits robbed a business. One thing Todd could admit was that Lester was creative at earning an income. The only problem was he didn't lift a finger for it. He would rather connive, steal, and cheat than work an honest day. With his face turned up to the sky and his rifle in his hand, he looked at the stars and prayed that there would be no gunfire on his ranch tonight. He had just finished his prayer when he heard the sound of at least a dozen galloping horses. Todd held his breath, knowing that they were only minutes from executing their plan. Now all he could do was wait. Chapter 22. In Jersey City, Scarlet had been used to crowds of people. At the train station, the docks, or even the main shopping district, you could expect to be bumped, bruised, or cursed at when every person in the crowd was headed in their own direction with their own chore or destination in mind. But Scarlet wasn't used to being surrounded by a crowd of people who all made her feel welcomed and loved. She stood on the porch with a bowl of salad in her hands and wondered just how she had become so lucky to be blessed with such a wonderful community. It was Saturday afternoon, and everyone and anyone had come out for the community grill at the Bicker Ranch. Neither Scarlet nor Jane had been prepared for the masses of people that had descended upon them since late morning. While Jane had kneaded the dough for another loaf of bread, Scarlet had quickly tossed together the ingredients for another bowl of salad. She didn't mind the effort. Instead, she savored every moment. She had never realized how comforting and welcoming people could be until they had stood by their sides on that moonlit night. "Scarlet," Agatha summoned her closer. "There you are. We've been looking for you." "I just went to fetch another bowl of salad," Scarlet lied. Her guests didn't need to know that they hadn't been prepared for such a large group. "Louisa, you take that salad off her hands. She needs to have a rest. She's been bustling around all morning. Come on, Scarlet. Sit here and take a load off," Agatha all but demanded. Scarlet laughed and shook her head. "Fine, I'll sit down. But just so you know, it isn't comfortable for long." Agatha and a few other older women laughed. "Honey, if you think you ain't comfortable now, you need to wait until you're 9 months gone. How far along are you?" Without judgment or secrecy, Scarlet felt free to give them the truth. "I'm 6 months along now." "Good, then we planned it just right," Agatha announced. "Ladies, let us begin." One by one, the women, some of whom Scarlet hadn't even met, walked up to her and placed gifts at her feet. Scarlet's eyes widened with surprise, even as emotion flooded her. "What is all this?" "A few things for the baby," Agatha said with a motherly smile. "Most of us had our babies out here on the frontier, and we know how hard it is to come by everything you need. Some of it's new, some of it's used, and some of it's probably been used more than once, but they grow so fast you run out of clothes quicker than you can sew them." Jane huddled beside Scarlet and whispered into her ear, "Say something." Scarlet sniffed away the emotion and looked at all the women surrounding her. When she realized she was pregnant, she had been mortified. She had imagined being ostracized and sent away, perhaps being allowed to stay in a shanty somewhere in Great Falls, but she had never expected this. It was simply too much. I never expected this from you, or any of you," Scarlet said through tears of joy. Jane laughed. "What she means is, thank you." "We know, dear, those hormones can make anyone weep," a woman teased from the back. Scarlet wept and laughed as she opened the gifts. There were vests, coats, booties, toys, and even diapers. With every gift that she opened, she felt the overwhelming joy of acceptance and love surrounding her. By the time she reached the last of the gifts, she couldn't believe how blessed she was. She held the bag against her chest and smiled at the women. "I was afraid of coming west. I didn't know what it would be like to be a rancher's wife, or how hard it would be to live on a homestead. But now I know that I would take every single hardship the West has to offer if it means having friends the likes of you." For the next hour, the women indulged Scarlet in unwanted advice, tips on settling a baby, and even how to heal faster after giving birth. Some of it was interesting, some of it outrageous, but all of it was heartfelt, and that was what mattered most. By the time the grill was done, Scarlet was grateful to escape to help serve everyone. She had just picked up a serving spoon when she felt Todd's hand slip into hers. "You're a natural hostess." Scarlet smiled up at him and felt her heart fill with love. "And you're a natural husband." "Not too bad of a crowd when you remove Lester Wills, is it?" Todd asked as people made turns to serve up their plates. "Not too bad at all. In fact, I've never had a large family, and today, for the very first time, I imagined how wonderful it must have been. Can we do this again?" Todd nodded. "At least once every summer." "That's a deal." Scarlet smiled at him over her shoulder. "Did you see all the things they brought for the baby?" "I did. Quite a spread you've got there. We'll have to start readying the nursery." "And get a crib," Scarlet added. "I'm already working on that. Just you wait and see. Now stop chit-chatting and serve the guests." Todd tried to sound demanding, but Scarlet simply laughed, knowing he couldn't be demanding even if he wanted to. Epilogue. Todd paced the living room, tossing a log into the fire every few minutes. The fireplace roared with dancing flames, but Todd hardly heard a sound. All he could hear were the cries from his wife, coming from the bedroom. He had delivered breech calves, he had faced a grizzly, he had even once survived a rattlesnake bite, but he couldn't imagine surviving this for much longer. Knowing that she was suffering and that he couldn't help her made him feel helpless. Frustration coursed through his veins as he stomped back and forth once more. "Todd, you stomping won't make her labor go quicker," Jane said, passing through with another pail of hot water. "How is she doing?" Todd asked with fear-filled eyes. She's doing great. It might not sound that way, but she is. Just remember, women have been doing this since the beginning of time. She'll be fine, Jane assured him. Todd shook his head. Women have passed in childbirth since the beginning of time, Todd muttered under his breath. Todd, I heard that. Think good thoughts, Jane said firmly before she headed towards the bedroom again. Todd drew in a deep breath and let it out with a controlled sigh. Just breathe, he told himself as he took a seat on the chair by the fire. Scarlet's cries began to intensify before everything went completely silent. Todd held his breath as if fearing that if he let it go, something bad would happen. He waited for a brief moment, but it felt like hours before the door finally opened. Congratulations, Todd. You have a baby boy. Healthy as a bull and strong as a horse, Jane announced before closing the door again. Todd let out his breath and cast his gaze towards the roof. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, thank you, thank you. The door opened once more, and this time Jane didn't close it behind her. Your son would like to meet you. Todd headed towards the bedroom, feeling emotion clog his throat. It didn't matter that the baby wasn't his by blood. As soon as he laid his eyes on the boy, he knew he was his. He turned his gaze towards Scarlet and saw how flushed and exhausted she seemed, and yet she seemed elated at the same time. He had never thought he would have the courage to raise another man's son, but he also had not planned on falling in love so easily. In that moment, the only thing on his mind was a verse from Jeremiah. For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper and not to harm you. He was prospering indeed as he felt love swell in his heart when his wife smiled at him. Todd accepted the baby the midwife handed him with a proud smile. Congratulations, Papa. Until Todd looked into the baby's eyes, he had never known that love could happen so quickly or so intensely. In the blink of an eye, he knew he would give his own life to protect his son. He would raise him, love him, and cherish him, and protect him from anything and anyone that meant him harm. He's beautiful, isn't he? Scarlet asked from the bed. The midwife and Jane disappeared into the hallway, giving the new family a moment alone. Todd moved towards her and took a seat on the side of the bed. He's simply perfect, he turned to Scarlet, just like you. Scarlet smiled at him and shook her head. I love you, Todd. I love you more, Todd said simply. Have you thought of names? Scarlet nodded. I've gone back and forth with it, but now I know what I want his name to be. And what is that? He needs to be named after your father and you. He's going to become the legacy of the Bicker Ranch, and he needs the right name to do that, Scarlet informed him with a smile. If Todd could be any prouder of his baby son, he wasn't aware of it. He squared his shoulder and smiled into his son's blue gaze. Then you're going to be Samuel Todd Bicker. Can we call him Sam? Scarlet asked. Sam it is, Todd confirmed. Jane re-entered the room. Sorry, I know you need time alone, but I haven't even held my nephew yet. Scarlet and Todd laughed as Todd handed the baby to his sister. Here you go, careful and support his head. Jane rolled her eyes. I know that. Can I go and dress him? I'll get the midwife to make sure I do it right. That will be great. Thank you, Aunt Jane. Scarlet smiled at her sister-in-law. With Jane and the baby gone, Todd turned to Scarlet and reached for her hand. What's on your mind? Scarlet let out a sigh of contentment. That this is the happiest moment of my life. Knowing that I have you, Sam and Jane, and that we no longer have to worry about Lester. I never thought I could be so blessed. Todd nodded. We'll praise the Lord every day for our blessings, and we'll pray for more every night. More blessings or more children? Scarlet asked with a doubtful gaze. Todd laughed. Children, of course. I'd like a big family. Scarlet shook her head. Me too, but can we wait until I forget the pain I just had to suffer through before we begin planning Sam's siblings? Sounds like a plan, and while we wait, we'll enjoy every moment of raising Sam. Are you planning to help me settle him when he is difficult at night? Scarlet asked hopefully. Todd laughed. I am planning on being there every single step of the way, just like my papa was. Todd paused for a moment and searched Scarlet's gaze. Thank you for writing to me all that time ago. If you hadn't had the courage to write that first word, we never would have been where we are now. Scarlet yawned, exhausted from giving birth. A very happy place. Indeed, Todd smiled. Dilly,